Welcome to my second conversation, just between me and Sandra. Last time we've talked about nihilism and the self as question. We took the first chapter, chapter 1, Nihilism as Existence, in Nishitani Keiji's book, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, as a starting point last time. And the topic was that with the advent of nihilism in, let's say, European history, also that the foundation of the self crumbled. And then there was then the need for a new investigation into the depths of the self that then people like, for example, Nietzsche conducted, but also then Jung and Heidegger tried to give their own accounts of what the self is. And that was just a necessity of the time. So this, what Nishitani calls, that we in order to conduct an inquiry into nihilism, it's also necessary that one has to become a question mark to himself. Today I would like to talk with Sandra about how the self is viewed in, broadly speaking, let's say the Zen tradition, and what the role of koan self-inquiry plays in for the self and for the inquiry of the self. Because we will also try to we will attempt to practice self-inquiry in a koanic way, a little bit different. But Sandra, what are your thoughts on what I just said? Maybe we'll see where we go.
So the first thought that comes to mind is that the Buddhists did not teach a doctrine of no self. That's a Western interpretation of the tradition. They did not teach there is no self. What they taught, what they practiced, what they embodied was that there is no self to be found. And those things are quite different. When you're, from a Western point of view, when you're saying, the Buddhists say there's no self. So if I practice Buddhism, does that mean that I fall away and nobody recognizes who I am and nobody can relate to who they take it very literally. It's a subtle difference, but in the practice, it's very important to remember that the approach is that there is no self to be found. And that is really what underlies koan practice, because certainly as Westerners, we're looking for the essential elements that constitute the self. Whether we're just, that's what we're looking for, because we've been conditioned to be an individual self. That's in our whole culture. Not so in Eastern cultures, by the way, but in Western cultures for sure. And so it's quite shocking to think that there might be no self, but nonetheless, you can't just adopt that as this is my belief, because then there is a self that has adopted that belief. And so the koan practice is just a way of gradually peeling away all of the misconceptions that we have that attach themselves as the self-representation, and allow for the opening up of a conscious experience that has been called emptiness, nothingness. It's been called a number of words, but the experience itself is experienced very individually, and it can't be sort of described, because then after that, you're looking, you're grabbing for it. So, oh, I experienced no self. I got woo, or I got moo. So the practice is for Westerners, and the practice that we'll be doing, Daniel, the dialogical koan-practice, is designed precisely for the Western mind.
Mhm.
But basically, yeah, there is no self to be found. But there's a lot of effort put into finding it.
Yeah, it's good to have it summed up in a paradoxical way, and that's always good. From your experience, what do you think is the difference between the West and the East in regards to the self?
Certainly the underlying assumptions that the underlying assumptions about what and who I am, which are completely different. I mean, certainly the Western influences have started to trickle into the East, but traditionally, there is no, I mean, there is no word for I in the Chinese language, for one thing. So if you're raised in a culture where there is no structure that you identify as the self, but rather you are embedded in the community, embedded in the society, and embedded in the culture, then it just doesn't form in the same way as it forms in Western society. And to an almost ridiculous extreme now with the self-esteem project for developing self-esteem in young people. It's really just enhancing the whole narcissism of Western culture, I think, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Maybe give one more example. So in Japanese, you have multiple ways of expressing I or yourself, and so there are a lot of pronouns, like not just 1, 2, 3, but like 10, 15, like really a lot. And it really depends on the social context.
Oh.
So the embeddedness, let's say, just where you are right now. What word for I you're using? Which also points that there's no substantial self, but it's always in a kind of, it's always conditioned by.
Always conditioned by the social environment.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you look at it carefully, the truth of that is really apparent to people. If you just think to yourself, if you've done none of this practice, but you think to yourself, well, I'm a completely different person when I'm with that person than I'm with that person.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This point, in some sense, I call this recently, I call it kind of like the hermeneutical like the hermeneutical character of human beings. So like, where it really depends when let's say, when I'm with my mother, different aspects of myself are coming forth or are drawn out, or when I'm with you, different aspects of myself are coming to the fore. Or when I'm, let's say, I know, when I'm a customer somewhere in a shop, then there's again another like aspects of myself. And really depending on the social context and the persons we are surrounding ourselves with, there are different aspects of ourselves drawn out or reduced, which is really, which points again to this fact that you said, then there's no self to be found.
Yes, there is no substantive self to be found. Yeah.
So what do you think is when people question themselves, doubt themselves, or fall into despair So how can the kind of like koan practice help them to go through that, overcome that?
Oh, that's
When the root of the self kind of like, when there's like a fog emerging and
yeah,
we don't know we don't know who we are,
yeah.
where we are going,
Mhm.
what life is, what being is, when all of these questions suddenly like are kind of like in a mist and become mysterious.
Mhm. That's a big question, Daniel. As you know, people who have questioned that deeply, deeply, deeply run the risk of madness. I mean,
Yeah.
right? And even brilliant minds like Nietzsche, you know, whether or not he was really mad, I don't know, but he had a breakdown, and so it's a, if you, I think myself, if you take that question really seriously, you have to acknowledge that there's a lot of risk involved. Certainly you're diving into the unknown. Certainly you are taking a path that is not a common way of being in our society, at least. There's not traditional supports provided for this kind of thing. And however you are drawn to address that question, and the events of your life will show you, if you look at it, how you are personally addressing that, individually addressing that question, then it's really good if you have supports in place. And at least at the beginning, if you have a teacher that you trust, all of the Buddhist traditions that have made it to the West have stressed the importance of a teacher. The teachers have themselves gone through quite a transformation in adapting to Western culture, and sometimes the results have not been pretty. But it's part of the way in which the gift of the Buddhist understanding of no self being introduced and translated into a Western culture. It's not an easy it's not an easy transition. It has not been easy historically, and it's not easy individually. But yeah, I think really you have to understand that you're not playing around with this stuff. Yeah, these are not parlor games. And sometimes, I mean, you're dealing with unconscious. In Jungian terms, you're dealing with the unconscious, and stuff comes up, definitely. You know, even stuff that feels like a crucifixion comes up, can do. So yeah, it's not to be taken lightly.
And precisely because it can't be taken lightly. I mean, the Buddhists kind of knew that koanic inquiry takes place at best in a sangha,
Yeah,
and in kind of, you know, mutual agreement with a teacher.
yeah.
And we talked about this in the dialogical koan practice, that when the other, or when we are held or be held in a kind of dialogical mutual holding, then we can we don't have to do it. We have to do this still by ourselves, but we are not alone, as you phrased it once. And that brings me perhaps to the next question: is then what is the role of the other really in this, in the inquiry process? What can the field of dialogue give us, afford us, such that the exploration, which is so which can be so dangerous, can be undertaken by us?
In this dialogic practice, what you're talking about, the
Yeah,
role of the
like
other?
what is really the field or the of dialogue? What is it? What is it creating such that?
Oh, this is such a rich area, Daniel. It's so incredible. First of all, what I want to say is that it's very rare that people come into embracing a practice like this with a genuine sense of, or a genuine ability to be a listening partner to somebody. Okay? A therapist, and I've experienced this in so many ways. A therapist is a listener, but a therapist also has their own agenda, their own obstructions in their own mind. That, you know, they're anything but a clear and present listening partner, even though their intention is to be. They're anything but, generally speaking. And probably I can talk for myself, but yeah, therapists have training, and that training interferes with their, can interfere with their ability to simply be a listening presence. To be a listening presence, a true listening presence, is a huge personal kind of development, and actually is the same as the development required for full enlightenment. A fully enlightened person is a fully present person. Anyone else is not fully present. That's what I think, right? And fully enlightened people have the kind of presence that is all surrounding them, and people feel that kind of presence. There aren't many people like that in the world, who are in the world today, but it's a palpable presence that is, that, you know, a fully listening presence. So the wonderful thing about doing this dialogic koan practice is that not only are you developing the muscles for doing your own self-inquiry into this self-representation that you've lived with all your life, but you are also extending that development of consciousness outward into the external for the benefit of others. That's a wonderful practice of this. That's a wonderful benefit of this kind of dialogic practice. Traditional koan practice does not include this second piece. And it was, I believe, because there was that part missing, that I was not able to, you know, devote my life to Buddhist koan practice as it's taught traditionally. And because you know, being a Westerner and knowing, and also being a therapist, knowing and getting an idea of how little as a therapist I was able to give my full presence to people. I mean, it is not to say I wasn't helpful, you know, I mean, anybody kind of sitting with you for an hour and listening to you is going to be helpful to a certain extent, but to be, you know, I mean, to be fully present to life, that how many of us can be? You know, how fully at present and fully accepting of life. We're always fettered by wanting things to be other than they are, by our own ideas, our own projections, all that stuff, all those fetters we bring. So the practice allows or encourages the development of that neutral, non-involved, but absolutely present awareness that we can share with another at this intersubjective space. We can share it, but we seldom do.
That's insofar interesting, and the thought I just had is that then the dialogic koan practice that we want to try out is quite advanced in what it requires of the participants, I think. And I thought of it in this way. I mean, there are the two famous, I mean, there are 3 schools of Zen, but the 2 famous schools are Soto and Rinzai. And like
Right.
the key difference is, so Soto is just sitting, and Rinzai incorporates koan practice. So in just sitting, we're just with our breath, and we're just in silence. I mean, there might be like singing, like chanting, Heart Sutra and other sutras and so on. But anyways, the koan practice, I mean, helps you to do this inquiry into the self, into the layers of the self. Now, and for me, at least just right now at this moment, it feels like almost an advanced, and also to incorporate listening to others. And also in some sense, trying to share authentically whatever one experiences right now in the moment. So this is like dialogue kind of like gives a kind of depth dimension to the inquiry process. And then in the dialogic koan practice, then you also have, you have this multi-perspectival depth also opening of all the other perspectives that you will encounter in like the process, which gives us then this sociological component that all the Eastern societies have, where you are always embedded in a social context. You're never just with yourself, isolated. You're always with others. And this kind of this having all those perspectives present, and also then perhaps realizing how they inform your own selfhood, can, I think, also teach you something about the self. And this also comes up, I think, in the practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think of it as, I mean, Ian McGilchrist has pointed out recently the left brain, right brain. He's done a lot of work on that, wonderful work on that. And I think of it as a wonderful balance of left brain focused inquiry, but then moving into right brain, open awareness and sensitivity to context. It's a wonderful way of balancing that. And when the practice is done, that shift back, the regular shifting back and forth is for me a wonderful way of redressing the focus of Western society on left brain function, which has brought us to the edge of the abyss, as Ian McGilchrist points out, this acquisitive, focused, doing, grabbing, manipulating the functions of the left brain that are a wonderful way of being, of showing our human ingenuity, nonetheless, at the expense of right brain embedded awareness. So this, for me, this is that kind of balance brought in, basically enacted. And that's why it is such a dynamic learning methodology for people. Mm-hmm.
So this peculiar or special design of the dialogical koan practice that seems to kind of like bring out a kind of balance of right brain, left brain. The question I still want to ask is how we are now perhaps better prepared to go into the depths of the self, where we don't know what we will encounter, where the unknown, where we face the unknown. When we do it authentically, we face the unknown. But now suddenly what we could say are benefits of this practice are we kind of do not go in a kind of schizophrenic mode where we either experience a schism between us and the others, or within ourselves, like in paranoia or so,
or dissociation.
Yeah,
that's a common thing. Dissociation. Yeah.
Or between, or schism between us and reality.
Yeah.
So what it kind of maybe gives us is this. So there are the others that support us and hold us, and then there's this rhythm of listening and speaking. And that's kind of like balancing perhaps of the two hemispheres of the brain, and that also holds us. And then then we are perhaps better prepared to go into the unknown.
Into the unknown, yeah. And the unknown, I mean, it's really funny because you sort of think, oh, well, I know what is the stuff that I'm not showing to people. I know what it is already, but that's not true. You don't know it because it is unconscious. So it really is, and the way it appears, the way it suddenly appears, can be very surprising to you and everybody else. So that is where the practice, the container in which the practice is done, needs to be very intentionally created and held. And the people who take responsibility for doing that, for holding this container, have a genuine respect for the importance of creating that safe container. It's very, very important.
Mm. Mm.
Because really nobody knows what's going to show up. And the only, when, in my experience, when things have started to get really hairy for me, I came from doing a number of different practices and realized that there is actually no one person who I can put my full trust in. There simply isn't. I'm not in regular contact with a fully enlightened person. That's just the way it is. But the wonderful, simple, and yet very powerful basics of the practice being that I speak and you listen, and then you speak and I listen, and that's all we're doing. And nobody is getting involved in fixing anybody or commenting on it. All we are doing is speaking the truth of what is arising for us, and the other person is, with genuine care, doing their best to simply listen. And knowing that that's the basic structure of it. It's a lovely, very, very simple and very neutral container that's non-personal. That's what has gotten me through all the crises that have come up as a result of this unconscious material arising all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if that's what your question was.
My question was kind of when we go into the unknown, or when, I mean, my question was more like, when kind of like what nihilism, right? You opened the conversation with nihilism, and it's still like this is still an issue that kind of like confronts us as a culture. I mean, because today the answer to nihilism is kind of like we try to reify the self as much as we can. So we have a lot of defenses, so we can master all the challenges in life. But at least speaking from, let's say, Buddhist philosophy or Eastern philosophy, I mean, this is built on a false premise. And as soon as life hits you hard enough, then that foundation is gone.
Yeah.
So in the conditions that you outlined, I mean, we see the kind of no thingness of the self, that it's no thingy, that we are always conditioned by others. And I think that's very apparent when we really, let ourselves sink really deeply into this again, being a listener, then also being a speaker, and just saying whatever arises, comes to our awareness. But for me, the question was kind of when all things become a question, as we said last time, when being becomes a question, when history becomes a question, when I myself to myself become a question, then when I take a question to,
even when the question becomes a question, Daniel.
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
at one point you drop the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it gets to that point. And then that's when things are really interesting. Because there's you know, as we were talking about, there's a balance between left and right brain. And if there is an overemphasis on questioning in the way that we think questioning works, left brain wise, then that will kind of destroy itself if the questioning is done, you know, continuously or continually. And then then the question itself drops. So that in the beginning part of the practice of both traditional koan practice and this practice, the emphasis is on holding the question as, you know, as it is. Tell me who you are, or tell me what you are, that sort of thing, or tell me what in what is woo or what is moo in traditional practice. And then that really conditions the practitioner for getting to the point where the question itself can drop away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then life appears as it is, and whatever needs to be done is done. And that's the freedom. That's the freedom of, you know, that there is, and there's no self to be found. There's no thing to be found. You know, it's just, yeah.
Life arising.
Yeah. In all its wonder and beauty. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. And the wonderful thing is there's joy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that there that's the wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the amazing thing, really.
Perhaps one other issue is, so right, Nishitani talked about fields a lot. So there's the field, what he calls the field of consciousness, is this, right? There's a reified self. The world is like an object. And then the self has some desires and volitions, and just, you know, like goes out and takes and grabs and so on.
And he talks about standing, where you take a stance, doesn't he?
Not sure.
And
The standing reserve is like a Heideggerian word where everything, but similar to this.
Okay.
And then there's the field of nihility, where everything sinks into nothingness and everything becomes a question. And also there's boredom, there's despair. There's it's like the world drops away, and like
there's the void.
Yeah. And you kind of like, you lose touch to life, to yourself. And so on.
When people experience the void, it's pretty horrifying for them.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, that this stage is like one that I'm quite interested in, then how the practice can, but we answered this in some sense, it's the other. And so you can, when you at least can express that there's a void and there's despair, I mean, that's like the first step when you're not trying to go back to your reified self or into idolatry, or I don't know, addiction or something.
Yeah.
Because this is something then you try to clutch, right? You shoot things, more and more things and but they slip away. It's like,
Mhm.
and slip away more and more.
Mhm.
So then with the practice, we get to this last field. And that's why I kind of asked also with the field of dialogue.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of like, this is kind of interesting how the field of dialogue and what Nishitani calls the field of emptiness,
Mhm.
how they seem to be maybe the same,
Mhm.
not sure.
Mhm.
If they are, if this, because Nishitani talks about kind of like, you know, the right self, the self on the field of emptiness is something like, he says we are all like, we are all like servants to each other.
Yeah.
We are emptying ourselves, we're giving ourselves over.
Mhm.
And when you talked about, you know, being the listener and
Mhm.
then being the speaker, it's kind of like, it points to this dialectic that Nishitani outlines at the end
Right.
of Religion and Nothingness,
Mhm.
where he says we are at the same time, we are kind of, we are our own masters, but we are servants to all other things,
Mhm.
to like the things, all things, like
Mhm.
the entire web of the entire Indra's net, the entire web, all sentient beings.
Mhm.
We are servants to all of them, but at the same time we are kind of like the master in our own house.
Mhm.
And this is a kind of dialectic that is going on in the field of emptiness. It's just when you were talking, this is
Mhm.
it's very similar, I think, to this dynamic of being a listener
Mhm.
and being a speaker,
Mhm.
and that none has like an ontological, like they are equal. It's not
Yeah.
that one is higher or more
Right.
important, but they are equal and they balance each other out.
Yeah. And they're in a dynamic balance always. There's nothing fixed ever.
Yeah.
And yeah.
They're kind of also interpenetrating. It's not that you're listening, then you're speaking, then you're listening, but it's like they are interpenetrating, I think.
Mhm. Mhm.
At some point, this will, I think, become clear that it's not just.
And the interpenetration, I mean, I'm thinking about the Martin Buber's I-thou relationship. It's sort of that when I read what he was saying about that, the practice really brings that into concrete, that the I-thou relationship into a concreteness that I don't experience in other social interactions. It's almost impossible to experience in other social interactions. And this kind of interaction, pure interaction, is an embodiment of that, of the I-thou relationship, I think, or at least it can be. Or the I-thou reality, that I am thou, together. Yeah. And it's a wonderful thing to experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
That I think probably at the least people doing this practice get a sense of they always say, I thought I was the only one that felt that way, that kind of thing, after listening to somebody they don't know, an incomplete stranger, and then they'll hear all this stuff that they've been thinking was their own personal hell, and they start to realize that they are not that, at the very least. But it can go further than that. I mean, I've been doing this for close to 20 years, not constantly, off and on, but it's been, and I've been doing other things, of course, as well, but it constantly surprises me that I keep on discovering new things every time I do it. Every time I do it, I discover new things about the methodology, the practice itself. I discover new things about what that practice is pointing me to. It's just never ending. For such a simple methodology, it's just brilliant.
Yeah, just being in dialogue.
Yeah.
I mean, not really in dialogue. It's more like this dialectic or interplay of listening and speaking. Which then lets you realize this kind of depth dimension, this more dimension behind every human being.
Yeah, it is actually pretty addictive. I used to I really feel there's things happen in life. I process them in my normal way. I do all this stuff. Then I have a dyad, and then another whole area opens up, and it's I would say I'm pretty much a junkie. Full disclosure there, Daniel.
No, I mean, because I mean, when you have something where you can realize, that there's always more.
There's always more. It's a moving thing. There's no end point ever. It's just so wonderful. Yeah.
And I mean, that's also, that's cool. When there is no self to be found, then there's that could be very horrible for some people when you when you interpret it in a certain way, but it can be very exciting and adventurous when there's nothing to be found. Great.
I don't have to hang on to anything. I don't have to hang on to any belief about myself or about anybody else or about anything else.
There's always freedom.
It's total.
And this is, I want to point this out. This is a very different conception of what the self is compared to, let's say, Western societies. And I think, this is now a little bit different direction, but I think this is a huge cultural problem, because in some sense we are all forced to reify ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
In some sense we have to create our own identities, our personas, and in some sense we all need our CVs, where we also only show, of course, what's best, and in some sense.
And the unfortunate thing is that increasingly we're being asked to take a stand either way on various issues. That's another new addition that's created more problems for us.
And then when there's a break to that former identity, and of course that for me it's more this, that everything's collected, that we kind of like we throw all of the facts of our life into the internet, and then kind of like it's all, and this is true for everyone who's on Facebook, and I think there's still a lot of people on Instagram or so on. We all have the story, right? But that there are maybe unconscious breaks in the story, that there are things that are, and this will happen, and then of course you don't know what to do with your previous self. And I think, this self-image that's always there and that you have to show to others, this is just creating so much psychological stress.
Well, anxiety. Everybody's anxious out of their minds these days, right?
And how they look and how they present themselves to others and so on.
How many likes they get.
But it's interesting that, you know, we could, that's kind of what I want to get at philosophically, is that we could view the crisis of nihilism as also a crisis of the self, and that we need to address it within the self, which is kind of like the depth psychological claim.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read or when you follow a certain interpretation of Nietzsche, for example, but it's also in Nishitani. I mean, again, as I tried to make clear, this all comes back to the self. It is a question of what the self is.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is, so that nihilism is also a deep crisis in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And how we relate to the world and how we look upon ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's something deeply flawed over to this in our time. And that this practice, maybe the dialogical koan practice, can help to at least have a more loosened relationship to ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
without, and then this is again without going off,
Yeah.
but always, because that's also a danger, but with always coming back to this relating to the others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because if you're like doing spiritual detachment or what's the word, spiritual, like
Asceticism.
no, it's more like, you know, when it's like bypassing inflation, you know, ego inflation, all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the other danger that you want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this truly is a middle way, I think. I do think it provides the kind of deep investigation at the same time as keeping the right side of the brain engaged in being present. Yeah.
I just had a thought, and
yeah,
I think the Zen people back then, I think they didn't need this, because the social context was kind of, you know, it's not like the modern individual West that's making everyone crazy.
Yeah.
So, because I mean they were not that isolated. These people were also in a kind of social community.
Absolutely.
And that the dialogical element can provide this, what was always clear in the Eastern societies anyways, namely that, you know, it's being, Heidegger would say, it's being with others, it's Mitsein, it's being in the world. And that's kind of like what the self is. And not just, you know, there's not just the self and then there's the world over there and there's a subject object division.
Yeah.
Because these are all modern ideas that's popped up in Europe after Descartes. And I think that's one reason why I think, you know, the traditional Zen masters were not so much in need of that dialogical element, because I think it was, in some sense, the social context was always there. And
it was. And even, I mean, if you become, you know, if as a Westerner, you become deeply involved in traditional practice, the spiritual community that is doing that practice with you becomes very, very important to you. What do you do with your other social obligations? Do you just leave them? You know, it's, I felt at one point, the more deeply I got immersed in this spiritual practice, you know, traditional spiritual practice, the more I was tending to remove myself from my other obligations, and that wasn't beneficial for anyone, including me. Felt very torn. I think a lot of people have that. A lot of people voice that. You know, I think I was a monk or a nun in my former life. I mean, I hear that a lot from people, including young people, right? And there is I think in all of us that need to go deeply into a really deep investigation into the self. There is. And that was provided traditionally by monasteries and spiritual communities. They're not prevalent now, but it doesn't mean that we still don't have that need.
Mm-hmm.
And doing a practice that is in this dialogic way makes that we have as social beings and as individual spiritual seekers, it balances that out really beautifully.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Nishitani wrote an essay that I can send you. It's called "On the I-Tao Relation in Zen Buddhism."
Yeah.
So he tried to work this out.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this one Zen story that goes something like, so there's one, it's Kyo-san asking Sancho, "What is your name?" And then Sancho says, "My name is," he says, "Ejaku," which is also Kyo-san's name. And then Ejaku says, "That's me." That's what Ejaku says. And then, "Well then," replied Sancho, "my name is Enen," which is his own name. So they have two names. And then Kyo-san is laughing. There are these, still sounds a little bit confusing. But it points to, I think this, it points to this strange, not strange, but to this like, this is often like between teacher and student. Mm-hmm. But I think still they think that in the authentic, in those Zen dialogues, mm-hmm. that this is kind of like broken up in some sense, and there's really an I and a Tao, and they are mutually interpenetrating. Mm-hmm. You are the Tao, and mm-hmm. I'm truly an I that mm-hmm. is Taoed, mm-hmm. which is then not a normal I, but like really like a Taoed I, which is a self realized by others in the more dimension. Mm-hmm. This is like, yeah. And I think this dynamic is also disclosed in those Zen exchanges, mm-hmm. that are transmitted, handed over from the tradition.
Right. The other image I'm thinking of is two arrows meeting midair. Mm-hmm. Right? But that not meeting midair, not staying there, moving on, yeah. Meeting midair and moving on constantly.
Mm-hmm. I mean, these are called mondo. And I would like to just read a passage from Nishitani. Mm-hmm. I think it's nice. So he says, "We are continually encountering others within the family, our wives and children, at work, our colleagues, on the streets or in conveyances, men who are complete strangers to us. Through history, we are able to meet men of hundreds, even thousands of years ago. Still, we do not consider such encounters unusual, and we certainly do not marvel at them. Yet what is to be found at the deepmost ground in the encounter between man and man? Basically, what is it that makes such an occurrence possible? This mondo," so this exchange that I read before, "probes these questions and unfolds and makes clear the boundless horror and the infinite beauty that are included at the depths of this everyday event."
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Where is that from?
I will send it to you.
Yeah, please.
and then what is the element, that enables our this very moment right now? This is always, we are always probing into this element.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'll read a little bit more. It's a little bit down. It would have to be something in which the absolute negation of the individual and his freedom are simultaneously absolute affirmation, and also in which absolute affirmation is simultaneously absolute negation. This points at what we said before with the interchange or reciprocity of listening and speaking. It would have to be a case of equality, with the negation of the individual and his personal freedom becoming one with the absolute affirmation of the individual and his freedom. But is such a universal possible? It is not possible apart from absolute nothingness, absolute void in the Buddhist sense, shunyata, a universal that would posit itself in a relation to the individual and thus become a universal that is, be it as a state, practical reason, God, etc., would in any case mediate, each according to its own law, between individual, and through this bring them to unity. Within this unity through law, the universal manifests itself as being, as something with self-identity, as substance. State, reason, and God are beings or substance. There, the relation between man and man itself is substantial.
Mm.
The individual therefore loses half of itself in the relation. Here it cannot be an absolute individual completely absolved from all relations, simply standing independently as a whole. On the other side, the universal, to a certain extent, is inherent within individuals and brings forth from within them their relation to each other. In its immanency, it cannot completely transcend the individual and cannot, as it were, deprive him of his roots. Therefore, as the individual's freedom becomes more and more emphasized, the unity through law gradually becomes worm-eaten and in the end dissolves altogether. This tendency is manifest in a lapse from liberalism into anarchism. One could call anarchism a natural state elevated to a higher plane, but through it, real freedom will never be achieved. So Nishitani is pursuing again this contradictory or paradoxical coexistence of freedom and equality, which he thinks can only be on this field of shunyata.
Mhm.
Because when you have something then like this relation to, let's say, God as the mediator, then whatever this other thing is always takes kind of like is ontologically higher.
Mhm.
But it's no thingness. And only then it's also where all beings can or are enabled in their freedom. I'll send you the text. I think you will
Thank
like
you.
it.
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of what I want to say is that this practice somehow brings me, because Nishitani was interested in the dialogical aspects of the Western tradition and kind of like writing about that. And what we're doing now is kind of like bringing that question again back into my head. Because I think he sensed that there was lacking something in Zen.
Ah,
Or at least that Zen maybe could give an answer, could at least there could be a fruitful dialogue between all those attempts of recovery of the dialogical aspects. We had Buber, for example.
yeah.
We have Heidegger, who also emphasized being with others.
Other, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think he sensed something there. So
Mm-hmm.
that maybe that could be also well, explained or elucidated by Western ideas, like the Idaho religion.
Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing the your next book mapped out, Daniel.
I don't have, there can't be a next book. I haven't written a book.
Oh, never say that. Just make as if you've already written several books and this is going to be your next book. Yeah.
No, but I will send
That would be wonderful if you could, bring all these ideas together. That would be very interesting to see where this goes for you.
I will send you the paper.
Thank you.
Okay, I will end the recording. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope this was interesting. I will also put a link to our first conversation down in the description of the video. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.